Welcome back to another episode of The Mucky Middle. I'm Nick Hunter, CEO and co-founder of B Corp creative agency Paper Moose. Today I'm speaking with Paul Oosting, Chief Growth Officer at environmental finance platform Acacia. Paul is a builder of communities and believer in people power. From his upbringing in the 1980s Tasmania to building a member base of 1 million people for GetUp. Paul and I discuss how people are choosing to be more sustainable on their own terms. This is The Mucky Middle. So thanks so much for joining us in The Mucky Middle.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Nick. Thanks for having me. And it has been a long history, and I've certainly been enjoying your work, particularly some of the recent ones I've seen. It's really exciting.
Yeah, awesome. So I guess, before we jump into kind of what you're doing now at Acacia, tell me about young Paul. Like, what did young Paul want to do when he grew up?
Yeah, well, growing up in the 80s, it was like fairly clear to me that I needed to be a fighter pilot. Obviously, my sisters were really into Tom Cruise. Top Gun had just come out, so that was the need for speed was very real. But I think for me, there's always a grounding in the environment, and growing up in northwest Tasmania in a small country town, I didn't know what that looked like. I think the career opportunities felt fairly limited, if I'm honest, but that's probably where I would circle back to. Went off to uni to study, majored in botany and zoology, and later a master's in environmental planning to explore that. But that was something that was always motivating to me, was the need for speed and the need for impact.
Yeah, interesting. And trying to accelerate impact throughout your career in lots of different ways.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and through that university period, I started to think maybe I'd end up in bureaucracy, working for a department of sustainability somewhere. There were periods when I thought maybe it would be ecotourism. But then there was a study actually towards the end of my time at university that said that every major ecological indicator was in decline, and sort of went through in some detail: soil, freshwater, climate obviously, and biodiversity and all the rest. And I just had that moment of like, I really can't picture myself working in a department somewhere in bureaucracy. And so really late in life for me, it was when I sort of turned back to this world of, well, what is campaigning? How do you get into that? So that to me was like a really seminal turning point.
Interesting. So that was kind of like that little red flags were going off in your head. How can I sort of reverse some of these things?
Yeah, I wanted to sort of play at the interface of those challenges that we were facing, and some of what I felt I'd been studying or careers I was starting to picture didn't feel like they were sending me in that direction. And that led me to rocking up to the Wilderness Society and saying, I'm here, I would like a job interview for a job you don't have, and if I can be of assistance, I'll work for nothing for 9 months and to get experience in being a campaigner, as we call it. Yeah. And so that's how I entered the space of the campaign world.
Interesting. And then that eventually led you to GetUp?
Yeah, that's right. I had the great fortune of, with the Wilderness Society, leading the campaign to stop Gunn's proposed pulp mill, which was a big campaign in the early 2000s, and lead the negotiations to save 500,000 hectares of Tasmania's forests, which was brilliant. But I'd always been attracted to GetUp because the model is really about putting people at the centre, and I love the multi-issue nature and some of the other work that they were doing.
And what was kind of your insights looking back at the methodologies of campaigns that work or don't work? Like what's been your learnings from that?
Yeah, I think my early years in campaigning, including that example I just gave around the forest wars in Tasmania and what it took to win there, were that it was very centred on us campaign staff, small group of really awesome expert people trying to influence elite level decision makers. And I think where my focus has shifted over time is not particularly surprising, is to the role of people. And I'm a really, really strong believer in the intelligence, in the power of individuals, and that actually people do have the right outcomes in mind. And often there are a bunch of things getting in the way, whether that's disinformation or the scale of PR campaigns by the fossil fuel lobby, as an example. So it's not to say that it's easy to find our underlying values and mobilise them, but for me that was where my sort of thinking about campaigning has evolved over the years. And I think the other thing I would say is where I think it's really interesting is the resilience that brings. We used to talk about the fact that environmental campaigns never won. And, we're seeing that at the moment in Tasmania with the new government saying we're going to unlock, in inverted commas, open up the areas that we saved back in 2010 to be logged. And so, what's the best way to deal with that? Well, it's not just influencing the key decision makers. It's actually that people want those things protected, that they see that as core to their way of life, what success looks like, what a great, lifestyle you might have in Tasmania, or being able to go and visit somewhere like that. So to me, it's just partly where there's something that I love, which is people, but it's also partly, I think, about what's strategic longer term and where the change actually rests, because that's where we need the resilience to scale up change and also to make sure that it's sustained.
How do you find the reserves to, like, I get the sense that you're very optimistic and you have a very positive outlook on humanity, where your history of work, you could have a very different outcome. How do you maintain that?
Well, I'm optimistic about people, and I always have been. Like when we started working on marriage equality, for example, and ran that amazing campaign, it was very clear that for many, many years, the majority of Australians wanted marriage equality. And again, did it mean it was easy to get there? Of course not. We had to run a big campaign. I think the same is true when we look at issues like climate change, environmental change, the drive for ethical financial products, or just green in general, actually, that these are mainstream views that cut across political ideologies. Conservatives want them just as progressives do. So I do remain optimistic there. And I think the other thing has been the privilege of having been part of some big campaigns that I really believe and have felt and seen many times that big systemic change is absolutely possible. And so for me, that's where I drive my optimism from, that things can look dire at the moment if you follow the news cycle too closely and or if you look at the science, absolutely. But also I believe that there's a lot there to work with in humanity.
And if you had to sort of crystallize your personal theory of change, how would you sort of frame it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, it rests on the fact I believe in the wisdom of crowds, and empowered people can create lasting systemic change. And so there's a bit to unpack there around what it means to be empowered, particularly in this day and age, because there's a lot of things that disempower us. The scale of misleading campaigns like greenwash that we see out there, the lack of access in some cases to, whether it's information or technology and tools, so on and so forth. But I fundamentally believe that well-informed people are the most powerful force, and that's what motivates me.
Does it keep you up at night, the disinformation? Because I feel like in the last 5 years, that has just gone to a whole other level. Like, I think people were misinformed or just maybe ignorant and didn't have access to the right information. But now there are, bad actors that are purposely putting huge amounts of money to misinform people. Do you see that from a perspective of like some of those campaigns that you were working on in the early days of social, how different that might have been with some of these opponents?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, disinformation is not my biggest concern. My biggest concern is probably the scale of campaigns that we see from, for instance, the fossil fuel industry. Yes, some of that can be misinformation or disinformation, but it's also, to me, just the scale of it. We see just such a huge tens of billions of dollars being spent to influence the consumer, the public, to influence politics, obviously. And we're seeing that play out, particularly this year, of course, in an election year. Absolutely, some of that falls into the dis and misinformation camps, but there's a lot of it that is just the scale of those pro-fossil fuel or anti-sustainability, anti-science messages. That is what concerns me the most.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I guess because we're part of Comms Declare and trying to ban fossil fuel advertising and all of that sort of thing, and that's obviously one way to sort of take away a voice in this way, but it is interesting to see how much money is being poured into some of these campaigns on issues that you would think would be no-brainers for people to support and get through. Yeah. And sometimes they just become a political football.
That's the challenge, I think, for all of us. And so, I think the work that Comms Declare and others do is fantastic. And, there's a couple of live examples at the moment with Shell having its tender out. And so, I think that's in really crucial work.
And I guess, so money is power. You're now at Acacia. Can you tell us a little bit about because you've gone from grassroots activism and getting the power of the people, and now really focused on how money can change as a force of good. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I saw over my time campaigning with nonprofits is that even for those who are really passionate about climate and environmental issues, we all face day-to-day cost of living issues, or wanting to make the right decision by our family, wanting to do the right thing for ourselves, thinking about our retirement and our superannuation. And the thing that really excited me about Acacia is that they've built a platform that enables people to make smart decisions that are the right choices, and be able to get clear information around how different key sectors stack up: superannuation, banking, home energy, solar, electric vehicles, and so on, so they can make informed financial decisions alongside the climate and environmental impact. And so to me, bringing those two things together actually was one of the things I think had been missing from the scale of some of the work that I've done over the years. Because as I say, even for a really passionate person like myself, when I'm shopping for my family, when I get to the till, guess what one of my key decision points is? Cost. And the reality is now that across those areas, often the smartest financial decision is going to be the most sustainable one. And I think that there's a myth out there that that's not the case. I think there's often been barriers in the way. Again, things like greenwash, that people know they can't necessarily trust what a company is saying. So Acacia has brought together a platform where people can get in there, find out how their own current providers stack up, and then make informed decisions around what's best for them. So to me, it's a really exciting platform.
And I think it also plays nicely into that feeling that we are a little bit powerless to change these enormous problems like climate change. But when you have a tool like Acacia, you can actually go, oh, these are the things that I can actually quickly do and shift things that might seem quite simple, but actually have massive ripple effects. And your money and your choice in that sort of situation does have power.
It absolutely does. And I think it's something we can be proud of when we've made those decisions, because it's not just the climate. Not that we should underplay that, because that can be powerful enough in its own right, but also to be able to show I've made the best choice here by my family or for my own future in whatever way you as an individual want to approach those questions is the sort of thing that can have ripple effects, to show leadership with your staff, with your customers, with your family for that matter. And that's where I think the possibility of that collective impact is really true.
Do you think we have passed the tipping point, or we're kind of like that now a lot of the decisions we make are actually financial and environmental, because it makes sense for me to put solar on my house because it will reduce my energy bill, and all of these things, there's not really a cost to me, so there's less sacrifice, do you think?
Yeah, that's right. That's why I think it's such an exciting time, because when I was working on this 20 years ago, some of the solutions weren't there, whether it was when we were talking about alternatives to the pulp and paper sector in relation to old growth logging. Solar was extremely expensive back then. And likewise, I don't think anyone was considering the need for, a sustainable bank or a super fund. And if they were, I can't speak to it for 20 years ago, but maybe some of the performance and so forth might have not been where it is today. Whereas today, I think if you look across all of those industries, we're absolutely past the innovation tipping point. Yeah. The solutions are there. They are, in many cases, the best financial decisions. People need to make those calls for themselves, of course. But I think that's where we're past the tipping point now, and we've already seen, of course, the slew of early adopters. Many of these businesses have large uptake already. Solar power, of course, is a classic example in Australia, where I think something like 3 million households now that already have solar. And my understanding is the vast majority of them have done so because they want to reduce their cost of living. And particularly in the current climate with a cost of living crisis, that's absolutely essential. So for me, things are ripe. We've reached a point of maturity. It doesn't mean the task ahead is necessarily easy to reach scale. But I think we're in an easier position where it's not about persuasion. It's not about trying to create new solutions that don't yet exist. The things are there. They've been well demonstrated in the community. Now we just need to get people on board.
What do you think is the thing to unlock that acceleration?
Well, I think the bringing together the financial alongside the climate impact, when I think about it from the point of view of employees, of customers, of the community. I think that is required to mainstream a number of these initiatives that are out there that I see across a range of different initiatives, that we are in a cost of living crisis. And even if we weren't, fundamentally, as I said, when most of us get to the till, we do shop on price. We can debate what's possible given the severity of climate change from an economic or a government point of view, but I do believe from an individual point of view, the win-win is genuinely possible. Certainly, I've experienced it in my life, and now I think that's where we need to get that out there and make sure that the rest of Australia knows that that's the case too, because there's a lot of people telling them that it's not. As we mentioned before, whether it's the fossil fuel industry or others, it's not like there's a blank slate here, or there's only one team on the field. There is another team, and they're deliberately putting barriers in the way. So, and that's part of the reason it's difficult, that these barriers aren't the fault of the individual. It's not like people are making the wrong decisions. There are those who are, whether it's incumbency, whether it's vested interest, who are actually actively trying to stop this transition. So it's an exciting time to be part of it.
Often we talk about how we exist to help grow businesses and help governments change behavior through behavior change campaigns, and a lot of your career has been sort of threading the needle with people, business, and government in policy. Where is the responsibility for making some of these shifts, do you think?
Well, I guess as I've outlined, I think it's across the spectrum. So, I think we need to put a huge focus on those who, in a literal sense, have the ability to make systemic change. First and foremost, the lawmakers, and likewise, the boards and executives of companies who have been responsible for, environmental degradation and carbon pollution. For me, the other part we shouldn't lose sight of is, in a sense, how do we get there? We can get there directly, messages, politics, elections, brand focus, and other things like that go direct to the source. But equally, we have this other power, which is the community, which is people. And I do think there are some advantages there. People are ready, and it also gives us a greater resilience. So I think, to me, the exciting campaigns are the ones in which those two things come together.
And I think that's been our experience, trying to help both sides and helping fuel the understanding for the community as well as these businesses. And I guess when we look at purpose-driven branding and purpose-driven campaigns and that sort of thing, it is always what is in it for me, for the customer, and then sort of the external environmental, the other effects. Because I think sometimes advertisers sometimes get it the wrong way around, of presuming that first and foremost people think that the environment is going to be the decision maker for them. And we used to do certain campaigns around that, of thinking that, this is what the research says, they're going to care about it and they're going to switch to this product because of the environmental side of it. But really, when it came down to at the checkout, they would choose cost. What are the product features and the cost of it, and then the fact that it was doing all of these wonderful things for the world was a reason that they might stick with it. Or it might be, when everything is sort of all equal, which most products are these days, it might be the thing that sort of pushed them over the edge. Yeah, do you see that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really interesting. One of the ways I sometimes think about this is that I wonder if in the past, I can only probably speak for myself, but if I didn't confuse popularity and salience is the words that I think about. I don't know if they're the right ones. And by that I mean an issue like, do I want a healthy environment? Probably 80%, or maybe 100% will say yes. But then saliency for me is like how that's weighted against other questions. So do you want a healthy environment if it will cost you more, or if some people's jobs might be at stake, and so on and so forth. And to me, that's the salience question, and where that leads you, I think, to thinking about how do I bring in those other messages, like the financial benefits, like the other lifestyle benefits, brand benefits, etc., that might come from those decisions alongside the benefit to the greater good, which is the environment or human rights, whatever it might be. So I think I think that's been a lesson for me over the years, is to listen closely to that question of what's salient in someone's life. What are they really grappling with day to day? That's
interesting, and I guess where they sit in that friction point in their decision making, and where we can potentially nudge them just a little bit over the edge.
Yeah, and I think like solar panels is an interesting example. Like that to me, I think it's great that it's a decision that some people make purely on a cost of living basis. That's a great outcome. And if that's the way that for many Australians, the need to get household solar should be messaged, fantastic. Another example might be Tesla. How often do they talk about the climate and renewable energy objectives? Never, maybe? Yeah, it's not the Tesla is the best green car, it's Tesla's the best car. Which in this case, it's the fastest, or it's the comfortablest to drive, or it's got the coolest brand for a period, which maybe it's in question now, but certainly for a period there, absolutely was the coolest thing in town, right? And so to me, that's what we're talking about here, is that whether it's brand, whether it's cost, whether it's status, whether it's your doing the right thing by your family and so on, those other drivers, we can't underestimate those.
Yeah, and I think the EVs is an interesting example because, a lot of the rhetoric is, it's just for the eastern suburbs or for wealthy people. But actually, a lot of the western suburbs is the highest growth and uptake because, they're commuting a lot more than others and there's a cost saving there.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to sort of see those shifts, and actually it is becoming more about a dollar saving element, and the fact that it is environmental is fantastic. And we're going to see that sort of adoption hopefully accelerate.
Yeah, that's right. And what you touched on there is that it's only for those in the eastern suburbs. To me, that's like somewhere on the spectrum of greenwash, right? That there will always be those to say that, people will never make the choice to choose an ethical, bank or a super fund, or, it's too hard for this, or, they're too expensive.
It's a luxury.
Yeah, it's only for the woke people, or it's only for those rich people. So, these are the barriers that we're up against, but I don't think that they're substantive or in a sense real. I think we're going to see those are going to be extremely well funded through the media, through advertising. But these are the barriers we need to navigate our way around and overcome, because there will be pushback. We shouldn't think we're, as I say, in an uncontested space.
Yeah, we're not home and dry yet.
That's right.
I feel like politics has also become there's a much larger gap now. It's much more extreme between the left and the right, and kind of that rhetoric there, both here and all around the world. How do you think we get back to a more sane conversation around these things?
Yeah, that's a challenging question, I think, because of the additional elements that are there in politics and even in some of our news and social media platforms. Because I don't think we should underestimate those things like algorithms, like the way we're consuming news, which was very different for me growing up in Wesley Vale, where my dad would insist we watched 3 newses in a row every night, and there was one broadcast way to get the news, which was the newspaper or the TV or radio, but it was not like now where the algorithm determines what you're seeing and creating a reinforcing bubble. But I think about again, it's hard not to come back to the recency of the point around there are ways in which I think when I look at an issue like climate change, that there are ways that can appeal across the political spectrum. Australia, for instance, is endowed with the critical minerals we need to fuel the batteries of the entire world, actually. I think Australia has some hugely disproportionate amount of lithium, as an example. There's a narrative there, I think, that is not going to be progressive or conservative, blue or red, that can actually, good for everyone. And I do think that's where the leadership of groups like business leaders in particular is important, actually, because it can be very difficult. For instance, you might think, well, this is a job for the political parties, but I think they're going to find it very difficult to shift and achieve that, actually. They have some incentives not to, for instance, winning elections, for instance, which is a zero-sum game. And so I think what's interesting for me is to find those business leaders who can see a positive sum game and can see that actually there's a way here to bridge. Australians want regional jobs. They want to do manufacturing in Australia, and there's all those opportunities if we think about that lithium example. And so who are those people that can bring it together, and I think what I'm looking for are those business leaders and others who can see the role, beyond, for instance, just emissions management in climate change, but in actually leadership of their stakeholders, which are the staff, which are their, supply chain colleagues, for want of a better word, which are their customer bases, but also that wider role in the community, because I think it's absolutely possible to have a sophisticated debate here. As I mentioned, people are intelligent. We should believe in the wisdom of crowds. I don't think it's the fault of people. We can have those discussions and we can hear those messages, but at times there are just a lack of people stepping into that debate, in part because of the intensity of the polarization, which certainly I've experienced myself.
Yeah, I can imagine. And I guess that's another nice piece around, storytelling and being able to share that blue sky vision of what Australia could be doing and what, where we could be leading in the world rather than sort of 10, 15 years behind as sometimes we are. Do you think there is a skills shortage in the ability for politicians and leaders to actually tell those stories in a compelling way?
I suspect that people haven't always seen it as their role. I suspect that there's an additional literal creative skill set we're talking about here, which of course exists in any big business in terms of, marketing and advertising and, bringing staff along on a journey, which is all key to storytelling. But I do think there's another layer here where what's needed is to take the story a little further into the community with brand, and that's potentially new. I think the other thing is new, that the stories aren't already being told. It's always easier to tell a story that's already been told and tell it better and iterate on it. And that's been one of my lessons over the years, is that there's not a perfect message, that actually iterating and learning and adapting is a better practice in my experience, at least. It's not
to create that longer-term memory structure.
Well, partly for the repetition, so that people can feel that they get it and have heard it, but also just to, in a literal sense, to improve the message. I guess I used to think that there was, an industry which was a black box to me, like advertising was, you would wait for the perfect message to come out. Whereas now I think about it as being more iterative, of learning for different audiences, different parts of Australia, but also just, what's going to resonate the most, because these things can be hard to land.
Yeah, I've definitely, because often the expectation is that we sweat over to try and get that perfect message or that perfect way of communicating this thing. And I think particularly the way that social media is set up, you have this opportunity to be iterative, to change, to test, to continuously sort of see where we can make incremental improvements and see where something is resonating better, and then potentially go big on it, rather than going big and then seeing, oh no, that didn't work. Let's go again in another 6 months.
And what's been your experience? Because like hearing you say that makes me think that's probably a practice that doesn't feel very accessible to a politician or a large corporation, because they probably feel the risk of getting it wrong is so huge, and the traditional practices would be to refine a key message and then broadcast it at large scale. What's your reflection? Do you think people there's a risk factor that's blocking others from taking that approach?
I think it's risk and bureaucracy. Like the way governments are set up is that it has to go through, peer review, has to go through testing, and although on reflection, like our Don't Be a Tosser campaign, which ran for 7 years, was pretty consistent, but we changed elements within it over that period of time to sort of continuously tweak and see where we could really shift the behavior. So that was on a very big, out of home, through the line way. But generally, the smaller clients that have less gatekeepers are generally easier to work iteratively, because we can go, okay, well, let's use TikTok and let's see what's going to resonate with our audience here, and we'll do some A/B tests, and then we'll go out with an idea. We'll see if this edit works, or because we have all of our production capabilities in house, it's quite easy for us to continuously iterate. But a traditional agency has production partners and so it makes it many more barriers of entry to sort of actually bring it back into the studio and change it, or bring it back to the designers, and so then suddenly you have all these costs as well. So that's something that Brad and I have been really sort of focused on designing, is this kind of really seamless ability to go from great idea, produce it, pop it into market, test, learn, and continuously iterate on it to see where we can have that creative performance as well. Which is, it's definitely not what most companies are set up to do. But
it seems to me like it's a key advantage of where, again, technology is at now, right? Like when I think back to when I started campaigning in the early 2000s, it was broadcast, paid media. And what else did we have? We had, things like direct mail, which were very expensive. And again, you would spend time to write that one perfect direct mail piece of letter. And of course, you had advertising or the news media as your sort of chosen outlets. Of course, you can't, iterate a news interview. You got one chance to get one message across, and ultimately, of course, the gatekeeper and the editors who select which quote they take from you. So, that's a very different world to now, when you could spin up thousands of messages, I guess, to test what's going to resonate before having to lock in a decision. So yeah, and that's where I think we need to listen more to the community to see, as I say, why is it that 3 million households have already gone solar, and what's next? How do we build on that momentum?
Why has the rest of Australia not yet?
Yeah. Well, that's an equally good question.
Because we've got all of this evidence, and I think you always, because we work with Bright, and a lot of what we were looking at there was, when you see a neighborhood and you see one house with solar, there'll generally be another one there is this kind of infectious kind of momentum that happens in areas that you can kind of see, and it's spreading through different communities.
Yeah, I love that. And it's one of my reflections that for us campaigners, like whilst we're great at building social movements, I think there's something really interesting around particularly the social media world, but now most platform businesses like an Airbnb, for instance, where they really get good at measuring network effects, as they would call them. And I think that's another sort of lesson that we're still probably catching up a bit, on the Facebooks of the world, on the Ubers of the world, around how do we build network effects really deliberately into the solar experience, because it's happening organically. As you say, one person gets solar, they tell their neighbours, hey, I'm saving all this money, you should do it too, or they just
walking past it every single day, and you're looking up at it and going, and you're seeing other messages, you're kind of being influenced by all these elements, but you're seeing the solar every single day. And I think the same is probably true for EVs, because you see a lot. I feel like in the last 12 months, the amount of EVs that I'm seeing on the road is just skyrocketed. Yeah. And I feel that will continue to happen. It has this momentum and that network effect.
Yeah. Yeah, I just think there's a degree to which we can be even more deliberate about that. I don't know what your experience is, but just how do we build that into those, whether it's advertising campaigns, communications, or even the products themselves, to make sure that we make it easy for people to bring the crowd along with them. Because I think most of us want to. I mean, I certainly, of course, I can't stop myself wanting to put things out there. But I felt that way after our little road trip in our EV over summer, because I probably went away thinking, oh, this is going to be a little bit tough, driving a couple of 1,000 kilometers, having the car packed to the rafters with all our camping gear, and it was actually just super easy. And so I felt compelled to tell others. But I do think there's a degree to which could my car manufacturer, for instance, have played a more active role in that decision. And so I think for product providers, for agencies, thinking through how do we measure network effects, how do we get more deliberate about it, is something that's really needed.
Well, and I think being able to pick up on stories like yours and actually extend that storytelling and bring it into other worlds, and seeing a family camping with their EV and building out the world of what is possible with an EV, because I think there are still a few barriers there that we need to I know when I talk to my parents, then they still have some hang-ups that have been influenced by traditional media or something like that. And I'm like, please don't buy another petrol car. Please don't. But there's still certain elements that haven't clicked in yet in their decision buy journey, and there's a real responsibility for us to sort of help reduce those friction.
100%. And again, it comes back to me for the contested nature of the space, right? Because your parents are no doubt seeing a whole bunch of messages that are being funded by incumbent fossil fuel car producers who are saying, you might not want to buy an EV yet because you're probably not going to be able to find somewhere to charge it. So some of it, yes, it's the infrastructure, but some of it, as I say, we shouldn't understate the role that the contested space in which we're operating at the moment is part of it. It's been disrupted. There's a bunch of early movers, but now getting into that early majority is a different task, I think.
I guess you've worked in a lot of commercial businesses. You've worked in NGOs. Where do you think NGOs sometimes get it right and sometimes where they get it wrong in terms of effectively trying to achieve their goals?
I've been doing some training and advisory work alongside my work with Acacia, and just still a space that I'm passionate about. And one thing that strikes me is that sometimes people aren't planning to win. The scale of change that is needed can seem daunting, and there are reasons why it can be hard to aim for that are good reasons, constraints of our budget or constraints of our organizations, and the risks and so forth that we're willing to take. But I do think that to me is one of the challenges actually that is probably cuts across sectors. So I'm not just sort of focusing this on just on NGOs, but I do think it's important to be planning to win. But sometimes it can feel like we should plan to, to oppose, for instance, if we're in an NGO. That's one common one we can see sometimes, opposition, protest, playing a certain role that you might be pigeonholed around, and that sort of business as usual approach. So I think for me, just being clear around what it takes to create a broad church to reach the sort of supermajority of Australians is what success looks like. Our issues should be getting 75% support. What we're talking about here is what the world needs, what's going to make a better world for everyone. That's not contentious. And so that to me, though, is where I get excited when I see works from nonprofits and NGOs, are those people that are building that large community and thinking with scale in mind and with impact in mind.
Do you find that a lot of the role in the campaign is also to take the fangs out of the issue, like to kind of neutralize it and make it so that a supermajority can get behind it?
Yeah. I think it's about, finding the way to position it as something that is accessible to everyone. And again, saving money on your power bill is another person's, protecting the world from runaway climate change for my grandkids, that to me is one and the same message. And it's just, one, you've been more deliberate to depoliticize, to create access to the topic, and in others you can lean into it. And so I think there's that degree to which, in some cases we do need to do that more deliberately, and it's not always realistic to wait on political leaders to do that. There are incentives there. They're playing a zero-sum game. They need to win elections, and if that means there's an opposition, that might be at times in their interest. And so I think, that's where there is an important role for nonprofits, NGOs, and equally business leaders and startups, because that's the space they can play in, playing a positive sum game to bring in that wider crowd of people and get those messages across.
I saw on your website, download the app, upgrade your services, reboot the planet. It feels like we need a little reboot of politics as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's occurring. I think people getting more involved is part of that, whether it's actively agitating within an existing political party and rolling up their sleeves, whether it's standing for office themselves. I think that's exciting, and playing a role in making sure good information gets out there. Let's not be reliant on social media. I do think there's more of a trend of that, actually, of individuals going to a trusted newsletter or blog to get information and doing that directly. Of course, that's not at all a solve for the challenges that media organisations are facing, but I do think there are grassroots of positive signs out there with people getting in and driving solutions.
Yeah, I had Margie Vari on the podcast a couple of months ago, and obviously she's the CMO of the Conversation and all everything that's happening at the moment with Facebook now not paying for the newsreaders, and it feels like good sources of truth are getting further and further away from, or being less accessible. How do you think, what is the thing that we can try and shortcut that and try and stop that from happening?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the objective might be for those sort of organisations is to find a way to own their audience, in the sense of have them be in a way that they can control their own access. Easier said than done. Might mean for the Conversation having millions of person reach via email rather than via Facebook, which is. Yeah, that's right. Because I think with the Facebook example, you're renting a shop front in their shopping mall. What does it look like to have your own shop?
Yep,
That was a laboured metaphor, but
no.
You get the idea, right? I think that's as I say, easier said than done. But I do think that's the challenge with the reliance on those social media platforms, because my hope would be that they'll change. That people we see that change already with TikTok coming up and possibly Facebook itself getting a little tired. And so, how do you create a model in which people can get direct access to audiences and build their own tribes and followings and movements around their content, I think is the great possibility that still exists.
Yeah, it kind of harks back to what you said earlier around your dad making you guys sit down and watch all three news shows when you're a kid, because I think that is kind of part of it as well, because we get stuck in these little bubbles of, talking about the same thing to the people that already believe the same thing, and we get sort of, isolated, and which is why this kind of divide is happening between the left and the right so much. So it's about, I guess, giving people the ability to choose the right forms of news and information, and maybe make sure that that's diverse as well.
Yeah, I think there's a cultural shift that's required there to adapt to the new social media landscape that's only going to become more and more challenging. I assume I'm probably an AI optimist, but I do think there are certain spaces that in the short term are really going to suffer because of AI, and I would assume that things like social media and news will be one of them.
Yeah, I read an article that OpenAI is delaying a feature in their next in their product roadmap until after the election, because they think it could play such a nefarious role in creating misinformation.
Yeah.
I mean, it is like there are so many. I also am an optimist with AI, and we use it through kind of our day-to-day in kind of removing some of those low-level tasks, and it has created huge efficiencies in the business. But there are things that make me stop and pause and go, oh wow, what is this going to do for juniors and people that are trying to get into industries, and there's going to be a massive amount of change in the next few years, I think. But what makes you optimistic about it?
I think, after the invention of the car, we at some point we got the regulation of seatbelts. I guess I would hope that we can learn that lesson a little bit faster rather than having as many road accidents and lives lost. I think it's the same with AI. It feels like the Wild West at the moment. There are clearly a lot of positives that are coming from it in science, in productivity, but we need regulation. And, it shouldn't be the case that OpenAI is saying, we're not going to release this new tech feature that could totally destroy a democratic election because we want to. Like, that should not be their choice. That's the role of government. That's the role of regulation and legislation. And at the moment, the governments aren't up to speed, and they're not ahead of the curve in relation to where this technology is going. And so I think there's an important space here for civil society, for the community, and for politicians to be taking a leadership on this, to wrap their heads around how do you regulate this space? How do you put in place safeguards for people, whilst also, in my mind, hopefully getting the benefits of what this technology can bring to improving the lives of people.
Yeah, I see there's like a path to a universal basic income through AI, and there's something interesting there that if we can increase our efficiency as a country, as in the world, then surely actually there's the way that we can get to a place that we're actually working less and we're enjoying our lives and we're doing all of these wonderful, we're creating art and all this kind of, there's a nice future. Totally. And then there's another future where Sam Altman owns everything. It's like, I also feel that, the tech companies have been running wild for a long time, and government has failed to sort of keep up to them, and we're in kind of this exponential curve of technology changing. How can they, in a bureaucratic system that they live in, how can they get faster and make change at the pace of technology?
Well, I mean, I think those big changes, and they are big, because it's something that I think no doubt a lot of people in bureaucracy and in government, and like the rest of us, are struggling to wrap our heads around. But I think if you look historically of what's led to changes in those sort of contexts where there is uncertainty, are social movements. I do think we need that, actually, and where we need people to be asking for those protections to be put in place, or things to be slowed down a bit while the regulatory space is properly grappled with. And because I do worry that the polarization and the negative impacts that have flowed through to people's lives in terms of hate speech and so forth, and impact on elections that we've seen from the news and social media landscape, could just be the beginning. And the early signs of something that could be far worse with AI, actually, because of the scalability that's possible with that technology, which is possible with social media, but still requires a lot of manual inputs. And so, I do think that's going to require the public calling for that.
And I guess in terms of the network effect and talking about social media, how has marketing changed in your mind for Acacia? Like, where are you looking? How are you approaching kind of that growth?
Well, yeah, for us, I think it's about that, just honing in on that win-win opportunity that is absolutely now real across industries, banking, super, solar, home electricity, transportation. That to me is the exciting component of where things go next. There's, the research repeatedly comes out. There's been new research even in the last few weeks around Australians' desire to see the values that they hold matched by their bank or their super fund, and they're expecting, their home energy retailer to be having a transition plan and so forth. So for us, finding that win-win where we can demonstrate that those different objectives that people hold are going to be achieved and are totally possible now, to me, that's the exciting opportunity and how to build that scale and momentum. And I do think that the early movers in big business will be rewarded. People will want to work for their businesses. They'll want to stay longer. And I do think there's a compounding impact of leadership that you learn how to communicate, that you learn how to position these products. So yeah, I think that's an exciting space and opportunity.
And as a leader yourself, what are the learnings that you've had in terms of managing people and inspiring them into your mission as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think when I think back to some of the best moments, I've definitely had some management challenges and low points. And when I think back to some,
as everyone should,
yeah. But I think, there was a phrase that I used to use, and it used to frustrate some, but like when we had a leaderful team. And I think, to me, that's something that I still generally believe. Like, I just think that people are capable of so much. And there's this moment as a manager or leader when, you almost feel like your role is to get out of the way. You provided the enabling components, of course, and it's still there. But actually, that's how it sort of feels, actually. And then to me, that's what I would call a leaderful team. When people are going off with a clear mission, you can totally trust them to follow through and deal with decisions as they arise. When I think back to those moments of like, wow, that moment was just amazing. We were doing so much, doing exponentially more than I would have thought possible, was when there were leaders stepping up across the organization.
Do you find that in terms of recruitment that you look for a particular thing in people?
I mean, one thing that I learnt early on from some of the people that I was hired by was that we shouldn't underestimate passion for purpose. I do think that that's something that I have found really does matter, that people who genuinely believe in what you're doing and want to make it succeed, they typically will find a way to make it succeed and will be there to get the job done or, to navigate around challenges and from a stoic point of view, see that the obstacle is the way, that, okay, this challenge actually is a positive, we're learning, we're going to do something different. And to me, I often find that links back to, the alignment around the cause or the issue, even in a corporate setting, right, that they see that actually where this thing is going is a meaningful thing for them to help achieve. And I do think there's a really important role there for a range of big businesses now to bring that into how they operate and building that more into culture. Some of these challenges are systemic. They are all-consuming when we look at the impacts the climate will have across any sector. And so those roles, something that might have felt like an external purpose like that might have previously felt like it was something that should be left aside for non-profits or government. I think there's actually absolutely a role now there for business in playing that leadership role, and people want to have that purpose.
From a recruitment point of view, I've found it incredibly valuable to have a very clear purpose and vision, and if people aren't kind of on board with that vision and could be at any kind of advertising agency, I find that they don't generally last very long because it's like it's a very clear, everyone is sort of focused on moving the world into a positive place and doing that with our incredible businesses that we work with. So it is an interesting thing of sort of trying to clearly understand in those initial meetings of like what do you care about, what are you passionate about, and
how do you find it goes teasing that out? Because I imagine, do you literally have a purpose statement or an objective? Because I would imagine that there's a degree to which it's often fairly clear for people who get that or feel it or have come to you because they already know that that's your mission, potentially. I don't imagine it's that hard to work out.
Well, so our vision is to create a world where the good organizations reign supreme. So we want to fuel the growth of good organizations, and our purpose is to make positive change through creativity.
Okay.
So that's kind of why we wake up in the morning and go to work, and we want to use creativity. That's our superpower, but apply it for good things, not bad things that are subtracting from, which is interesting because and that's kind of why I started this podcast, because often there are lots of grey areas in what we do, and not every business is where they potentially need to be or would like to be, and so our role is often to help them along that journey.
Yep.
But it requires nuance and discussion. But I guess talking about the mucky middle, and you seem very like you've lived a very clear vision in your life and haven't necessarily made that many compromises for that vision. Are there times that you've had to make compromises and had difficult decisions when wading through the mucky middle?
Not particularly. I mean, if I'm honest.
Yeah. That's it's actually been the answer to almost every guest.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
That's so interesting, because I was just like, I feel like maybe I should say yes. I mean, it definitely,
depends on the industry, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. Like, I mean, for me, and I think about this a lot at the moment, probably because I'm just on the other side of it. But I think, for me, the transition from nonprofit world to for-purpose world was definitely a big transition, and it took a year or two to work through, and felt a huge amount of anxiety and stress. I would almost put it out there like a midlife crisis, for instance. And so, so there's those moments, but I think the underlying clarity of, I'm looking for something of purpose, and I know these things, do mean you have the North Star there to get you through those periods, I think is probably the benefit of making sure you can personally articulate what are those things that you care about and want to achieve and want to work on. So, yeah, and it's not to say that a life of purpose-led work is easy, because that's the other thing that comes to mind, of course, the impact on family, the long hours and the stress that can come up. But otherwise, yeah, it's a good way to live, I think.
Well, awesome, Paul. We've gone like really around the houses with all sorts of topics, but I guess just to wrap up, if you had to tell your 20-year-old self some advice, what would it be?
I think back to really little things like just being a bit more adventurous, which, seeing that mountain in the distance as you're driving down the highway and just saying, just stop the car, go and climb that mountain. Like, why not? Which might sound like a funny anecdote, but that is one thing that comes to mind, just seizing those moments more.
Yeah.
So yeah,
take a beat and feed that curiosity.
Yeah, I don't sort of regret doing the 70-hour weeks campaigning. Those are amazing opportunities, but I also think it's important to seize those moments to taste the rain. And I would tell myself about the Einstein quote of the power of compounding interest.
Yep. Yes, I needed to learn that 20 years ago as well.
Yeah, that's right. I think we all do. So, yeah.
Awesome, Paul. Well, thank you so much for joining us in the Mucky Middle.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to The Mucky Middle. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I enjoyed having the conversation. If you did, please hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts, and if you feel so inclined, give us a review. It really helps other people discover the show and gives me a little dopamine hit as well. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me on LinkedIn or shoot me an email at nick@papermoose.com.
The Mucky Middle is a Paper Moose production. Music by Caleb Jacobs.